Terrell and welcome to this video. This is part 3 of a 4-part video series presented by Strathmore Papers, in which I demonstrate how to do people sketching in a mid-tone sketchbook. Last week we drew this character from reference. Her name is Tranquilina. She's quite adorable. This week we're going to be taking the sketch and coloring it with markers. Let's get started. The first thing to be aware of when using markers is that markers react differently depending on what type of paper you're using. Let's take a basic pink marker. I have Copic and a Prismacolor marker to show how they each react differently. So first of all, I'm just going to lay down a little swatch of pink on this brown paper. And I'll do the same with the Prismacolor. I'll take those exact same pink markers and do a similar swatch on white paper. Copic, Prismacolor. So you can see how differently they look on the different types of paper. Markers also act differently on Bristol boards and marker paper. Here's the same demonstration with a blue. Copic, Prismacolor. So you can see how on the mid-tone sketchbook paper, blues almost look green, whereas on the white, they're bright blue. Another thing to be aware of when using markers, Prismacolor specifically, the Prismacolor pencil is actually chemically designed to work with the Prismacolor markers. Meaning that the wax in the Prismacolor pencil blends really nicely with the alcohol from the Prismacolor markers. It's actually a pretty neat effect. Copics, on the other hand, react differently with colored pencils. As you can see, the pencil didn't mix with the marker at all. Granted, these are slightly different colors. Copics have a different carrier fluid inside them that gets the pigment from the marker out onto the page, whereas Prismacolors are alcohol-based. It doesn't mean it's a bad thing, it just gives you a different effect, and you need to be aware of that when you're using markers. One of the best tips I can give you for using markers to color, especially in a mid-tone sketchbook, to get the best results, you want to go slowly with the markers. You get completely different results when you go quickly with the marker than if you go really slow and let the marker soak into the page. When you go quickly, you get streaks, which sometimes you want, but most times you don't. To avoid that, you go somewhat slower. Finding the right pace is up to you, because the markers continue to bleed out after you put the marker onto the page. With that said, one of the benefits I've found from using this particular Strathmore brand of mid-tone sketchbook is that you get a really nice dry brush effect. And the way you do that is you use a marker that is slightly dead or dying, and you do quick brush strokes with it, meaning put the brush down and quickly go from side to side in the direction that you want. Because the tooth of the paper is slightly raised above the surface, the marker goes across the top and leaves a nice texture that shows the paper through it. And it can almost make it look like a watercolor painting, which is really neat. And we're going to experiment with that some in our demonstration sketch today. Now let's take some of those techniques and color our little friend Tranquilina. Very important, when you're coloring markers in a sketchbook, always use a bleed sheet. Usually I just tear out a page from the back of the sketchbook, cut off the edges that came out of the spiral, and put it behind the page that I'm sketching on. That way when the marker bleeds through, it bleeds onto this bleed sheet, and that way it doesn't get onto the next page and I don't end up ruining pages. I don't really have a preferred type of marker. I kind of use Prismacolor more often just because I've been using them longer. I'm kind of recently into using Copics. I like them, but I'm still getting used to them. There are two different types of tips. I guess there's 3 or 4 types of tips for using markers. This is a chisel tip. I actually like using the chisel tip. You get a nice hard edge, and the way you do it is, let's say the sleeve right here, I can turn the marker onto its point like this, and I can get a really fine line like that. Or I can just lay it on its side and pull down, and then I get a broad stroke with it. Both of them are really useful. Usually I'll push down at the very start of a stroke, and I'll lift the brush up as I stroke with it. And that way I get a nice gradient to it. So I'm pushing hard, and then I lift up. Push hard and lift up. What that does is it gives me a nice color variation to it. So you can see I'm switching pretty often from getting onto the tip of the marker to get those fine edges, and going onto the broad to get the broad stroke. Markers are great because you can keep reactivating it. These colors right here are mostly dried, but when I go back over it with the marker, if I let it soak into the page, it reactivates the marker below it. And what that does is it makes the ink bleed out and blend the colors, blend the color that was already there into the color that you're adding to it. So I'm just going around the drawing and adding just skin tone to it. And I think of it mostly like painting. I'm letting the marker bleed out the way you do with like a watercolor painting. So you can see these kind of look like blobs right now. And that's okay, I'm gonna go back and define it a little bit with different colors later on. So you can see how I'm constantly turning the marker to get those hard edges, and then going back with the broad stroke. I'm going to keep pointing it out because it's important. Now I'm going to switch to a different color and define some more parts of the drawing. So you can see with the brush tip how I put the marker down first, and then I let it spring out to get that line variation. So this is an example of letting the marker soak into the page. I'm going really slow, letting the marker blend. So you can see how it starts to look like watercolor after a while. So this is where it starts to get more complicated, when you're getting into noodly details with the markers. You have to be very careful with your strokes. Because especially with the marker already on the page, next to it, whatever you put down is going to start to bleed out. So you need to do it on purpose. You want it to bleed out. You just need to be careful about how close you get to the next edge. So a quick stroke doesn't bleed as much. Okay, I'm going to add some detail into her dress. It's got sort of this floral pattern to it, almost a tie-dye floral pattern. So I'm just going to take a darker blue and go into the dress with just some floral looking patterns. And I'm going to do the sharp edge all the way up to the top and then come down. That way I don't ruin that edge. Same thing down here. I create a sharp edge in the pleat and then I blend it out. I'm gonna go back again with another layer of blue. Each time I'm looking for edges, trying to define new edges with the darker. So I start with creating that sharp line on the tip of the pen, and blending out from there. I'm going to give her face some more definition. This is always a little intimidating because I'm using a really big marker. This is where mileage really comes in. You've got to be able to trust that you can pull off a drawing with markers. And to be able to do that, you've got to do a lot of bad drawings until you start to get better. Markers is really difficult. Coloring with markers is really difficult. On her apron, I'm going to try and add in a bit of a dry brush effect with this marker. It's kind of old, and you can see if I go really quickly with it, it has a nice dry brush effect on it. So I'm going to try and do that with this. Define the shapes. gonna do the same thing with the blue on her dress. This is an older marker, and if I go really fast with it, it gets a nice dry brush with that. I just gotta be careful not to go up into her apron. So I'm just figuring out where I want the line to go, put it down, and go really quickly with one bold stroke. So I'm adding in like the creases in her sleeve. I think we're at a good stopping point for the markers. I'm going to use a brush pen and white gel pens and some gouache paint to really punch it up and define the whole drawing. I'm just going to go in and add a little bit of highlights to bring out the drawing. And that's the nice thing about coloring on mid-tone sketchbook is it's easy to go in with white and bring the drawing out. So I'm going to start in her hair, and I don't want to go too overboard with this because it will start to look chalky if I go too far with the white. But I go really quickly. I put the pencil down and then I do a quick stroke. So you can see it already start to pop the drawing out. I'm going to do the same thing in her face. I'm going to go in and just add some highlights. I really love this expression in her face. She's like, what's going on here? What's all this about? And then you can also go down and add some rim lights towards the bottom, reflected light. That one you really don't want to go overboard with it because it starts to make her look like plastic. But it can have a nice effect. Now I'm going to go into her shirt and add a little bit of white to give the, I guess it's a vest, to give her vest some definition. Now I'm using a Unibalsino white pen to add in some bright highlights. You want to be really sparing with this because it can really take over a drawing, but it has a nice effect to it. Now the last thing I'm going to do for this drawing is I'm going to use Pentel Pocket Brush Pen to go in and really, I'm actually going to just ink it. I'm going to go in and define edges, do some fine line drawings. So usually I keep it with just colored pencils, a little bit of brush pen, a little whiteout and markers, and take the sketch about this far. But for the purposes of this demonstration, I'm going to use a little bit of gouache to see if I can punch it up and take it just a little bit further. So over here I have a butcher's pan. It's just a white metal pan, and I can put a little bit of water in here. This is just a wet paper towel. It's been dampened in the sink. And I put the paints out on the towel, and that keeps them wet, keeps them from drying out while I'm working on them. And I don't use a lot of paints, just a little dollop will do. Mostly since I'm only going to be using it for little accents here and there in the drawing. Well, that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. There's a lot that goes into learning how to draw and learning how to keep a sketchbook. So this is just an overview. Remember to be patient with yourself. Try to have fun. Remember that this is a building process and you're gonna get better and better and better every single day that you do this. And when you look back after filling up 5 or 6 sketchbooks in a year and see how much you've grown and how much your worst sketches now look better than your best sketches ever did before, you'll be glad that you started. And I hope you got some good advice out of these videos that help you along your way. I want to thank Strathmore for allowing me the opportunity to do this video series. It means a lot to me. I've really enjoyed it. Thanks everyone for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Keep smiling.